Clean Water Agency. For the purposes of our meeting, I will note that we have Will Arnold, myself, and our representative from Woodland, Rich Landsberg, and also Camille Clark from UC Davis. Absent this evening, Tom Stallard, in terms of voting members. So I will welcome a motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And why don't we open it up for public comment at this time? I see a lot of people jostling to get to the microphone, but apparently they are shy today, so they won't be commenting. We will now move on to a closed session, so I will adjourn for a moment our open session meeting, and so we'll go into closed session at this time. So welcome back to the open session of the Woodland-Davis Clean Water Agency meeting of June 20th. We are now on item 2, consent items. So we have a motion to approve consent items. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? None. So we are on to item 3, the Woodland-Davis Clean Water Agency operations update.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tim Bush, General Manager of the agency. A relatively brief update today. A couple of the main topics we have are where we are on the joint intake completion project, the Sacramento River Watershed Sanitary Survey, the water supply alternative study, which we did talk about at the last board meeting, and then our normal operations update. The joint intake project is completed. There's really 2 things that we're working on right now. We are working on closing out the vast array of permits that we had for the project's construction. About half of them are now closed out. The other half are underway. At this point, there's only 1 permit that we have to supply some additional information for. That has to come from RD 2035 from the original intake construction. As soon as they send that information over, we'll send that on to the state. But we sent in something like 4,000 pages of paperwork to close out these permits, so it's understandable that some of these agencies take some time to review that before giving us our closeout notification. We do have also some waterside erosion repair work we need to do this summer. We've been waiting for the river to go back down. That finally happened a few days ago. So we're going to meet with RD 1600 to work with them on getting a contractor out there this summer to do some levee erosion repair work. It's mainly due, it's right at the edge of the concrete structure of the intake itself. Vegetation didn't quite take hold before the rain started, and some of it did wash away. But that work couldn't take place until the river drops enough to actually see what all eroded and then actually be able to get a contractor out there and work. The Sacramento River Watershed Sanitary Survey, this is something we brought before the board 5 years ago. It is a state mandated survey of the entirety of the Sacramento River watershed in our case, basically to look for any type of potential contaminants that may be entering the watershed. They look at anything from like wastewater treatment plant discharges, industrial users, forest fires, illegal cannabis grows is now a thing. And kind of look at the whole suite of potential things that could eventually impact water quality in the river. One thing that we're party to since the last survey 5 years ago is we do daily rice pesticide testing through the regional group that we work with. And that's because there's a lot of rice growers immediately north of our intake. That affects our other partners downstream, so we work together on rice pesticide testing. Fortunately, all of those results are non-detect, so we don't have to worry about that, but we do daily testing. So we actually partner with several different agencies on this study. The total cost of the study is right around $250,000 to do every 5 years. We partner with City of Sacramento, West Sacramento, East Bay Mud, Sacramento County Water Agency, and Placer County Water Agency. The 6 of us together, because we all have the same requirement, it makes sense. Our intakes are all roughly in the same place in Sacramento River, that we work together and split the cost. So to the agency, we pay roughly 16.7% of the total cost. There's a few optional tasks that they include. Some we participate in, some we don't. So it's not exactly a split 1/6 cost, but somewhere pretty close. And we also do pay the city of Sacramento for their project management. They lead the effort, they do all the heavy lifting, set up all the meetings, and pay the consultant. So we basically pay them a little bit for project management time, so we don't have to do anything ourselves. Where they are right now is they're in the midst of consultant selection. They want to have a consultant on board by around September to start formulating the plan. It takes about a year to get the report done and get that process underway. On your agenda today is to approve a memorandum of understanding. This is essentially the same document that was approved by the board 5 years ago, and it's basically just the agreement that we worked together with the other 5 agencies. We agreed to cost share in the total study. I want to give you a quick update on where we are with water purchase agreement. Water supply this year is looking better than last year. Term 91 is not yet in effect, although I did check the other day when I sent the email out that the river did rapidly drop to the point that they could actually impose it now, which I was a little bit surprised about. But I think that they may not impose that quite yet this summer, and even then it's not really an issue for us. But I think there's still a risk of, in fall, if we get into November, especially middle of November, and there's no rain in the forecast, they may do what they did last year, where they ended Term 91 in October and then reimpose it again November 15th. That's still, I think, a possibility, even though we have reservoirs are full and there's a healthy snowpack. So we're working with West Sacramento again on a longer-term agreement. This one is probably a 2 to 3 year agreement. The reason why it's not a longer-term agreement is they have to renew their water rights with reclamation in 2020, so they only can guarantee us that supply for the next 2 to 3 years. And we may be able to extend it further after that, but they can't give us that guarantee until then. We're expecting the terms to be identical to what was approved last year. We hope to bring that to the board either in September or if not a little bit before, that we may be able to do a special board meeting earlier than that to approve that, and also the supplemental EIR that's required. Any questions on that?
No, doesn't look like it. Thank you.
The next item, this is also in the board packets today in various places, both in the budget and in consultant agreements, is the water supply security analysis. This we covered in some detail in April. It's maybe just a kind of a higher level overview this time. So a couple of main topics. The document that we have now was put together in 2009. At that time, they looked at the demands of the project partners. And if you look at that today with what was projected for today, we're pretty wildly off. The project partners are still somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% below our peak flows in 2012, 2013. So we want to look at demands and look at where are we now and what do we think our projections are going forward to kind of look at how much water do we need. The other factor back in 2009, the analysis was that Term 91 never happens after October 31. We now know it's happened for the last 6 years. That no longer is true. So a good chunk of the study is really looking at, there's a modeling program called CalSim, which looks at reservoir flows, precipitation, snowpack in the entirety of the Sacramento River watershed to kind of look at that to kind of get a better estimate of when do we think it may be occurring. And what's the update? To kind of give us a little bit of analysis of what is our risk profile. That from what it was 10 years ago is no longer the case. We know we have risk, but how much is that? So that's included in there. And then the next step is a very preliminary, we're not really going to get into any details of it, Sacramento River water quality regulations. This is the unimpaired flows in the Sacramento River. We feel that there's hope for a settlement that doesn't involve large-scale releases from the reservoirs in winter months. And even if that were to happen, that's several years out in the future. Very speculative at this time to spend any money analyzing. So we're just going to simply mention that there's this effort's going on, but not really analyze it in any real detail. The next step then is after we identify demands that we think we need and what our supply shortfall may be due to Term 91 in winter months primarily, but also a little bit of look in summer months when if we think Shasta critical year may come in more frequently, which cuts our primary water rate or our CVP water rate down 25%, and kind of look at what are our options for supply. It could include either a long-term contract or purchase of additional water rights. It could be expansion of ASR. It could be several other things. Is to kind of look at what are our options and then what kind of steps and schedules should we do? And that'll come back to the board when we get further along in that analysis. So that is on the agenda today. It is included both in the budget and also the contracts that are before the board. With that, I will turn it over to Stan for the operations.
Okay, real quick, normal slide show at most meetings here, around 22 MGD last month. You see the splits there, 8.6. UC Davis 1.4, we'll mention that's a tad above the 1.2, but given that Davis was not at the max, we tend to go ahead and share that water supply. From a cost perspective, it's the same, so they took a little bit more than normal. Again, all regulatory requirements are met. Annual activities have been completed, so all of our PM activities at the plant are all done, and nothing major to report there. And then our water quality and diversion quantities are posted to the website. One thing to note, and I think we mentioned this in the last meeting as well, although as of June 3rd, Woodland has about 1.2 billion gallons in the ground from their ASR program, and I believe they have a goal of testing one of those wells and extracting water out of it beginning July 1st. And that's essentially for water quality testing, see what effect, if any, having it in the ground for a month has had on that water. So another update we have, as we've mentioned before, we had some issues. This is on your agenda as well today. We had some issues, unexpected wear with the intake pumps. So we've worked through that with CH2 and now Jacobs to come up with a recommended fix and essentially work through a cost split arrangement with them, given that doing this now pushes out the ultimate anticipated rebuild of these pumps out further. So what we're recommending the board approve today would be essentially a cost split of those repairs, and that is on your agenda, and we can, if you'd like to talk about that, we certainly can do that when that agenda item comes up. And then also, as mentioned before, we did have a transformer failure back in January. Looks like some wires in the conduits were actually nicked. That's best guess at this point. Ultimately, that's what was shown. Repairs were completed in May, although after that we did have a electrical relay that did fault out, so we did have another short shutdown while that was replaced. But everything is back up and running and back on the original power split that was there before the January failure. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Do we have any questions? Camille, Rich?
The transformer that gave out, is it going to happen again?
We would hope not, but like any piece of equipment, it has the potential. I think in this case, because there was some wiring that showed some deficiencies, if the new wiring, they did have to go down, replace conduit and the wiring from the transformer over to the MCCs. So with that fix, I would anticipate that it's not going to, in that fashion, fail again. But like with any piece of equipment, there's always, some minimal risk that you could have some failures.
Will? Thank you for the presentation. I'll note that during our city council meeting 2 days ago, I had to think there, we did discuss in a little bit of detail the Woodlands aquifer storage and retrieval system in a positive manner. And we're kind of excited about investigating that possibility for the city of Davis. So I guess we are on to item 4, the budget for fiscal year 1920.
Hi, good afternoon. This is the agency's fiscal 20 budget. There's not a whole lot of differences from what was presented in April. If anything, actually, I think it's about $8,000 less than what was presented in April. So some highlights of the overall budget. There is no capital project this year. As mentioned earlier, our anticipation is that we will not have a capital project at any time in the near future. We're not planning on anything new. So there's really two main budget categories: operations and maintenance, which is dominated by cost related to running a water treatment plant and joint intake, and then also the associated oversight, permits, agency administration, and that kind of stuff. And then the other item, of course, is the debt payment for the loans that were used for design and construction of everything. The overall budget is request is 20.1 million. It's kind of split almost 50-50. About 45% is O&M, and the other 55% roughly is debt payment. And I'll go into some detail of these categories a little bit further down. But as you can see, about 80% of the O&M cost is related directly to operations and maintenance of the facility itself. And then the other 20% is kind of split between oversight of the contract, permits, water supply, that one actually includes the water supply and security study. That's about $300,000 of that item is for that. Agency administration, which includes our taxes, insurance, the various studies that we're working on, and also the operations contingency. And the SRF debt payment, those are set. We had our final amortization schedule about 2 years ago, so that payment is set for the duration of the loans. That will not change. In terms of our major budget categories, the O&M budget, about $7.6 million in total. Of that, $4.8 million is directly related to payments for operating the water treatment plant and the joint intake facility. We spend roughly $2.5 million a year on electricity and the 3 pass-through chemicals that we pay for directly. The other chemicals we pay for as part of the regular O&M contract. And then there's a small amount of money in terms of our permits, operations, that kind of things. Agency oversight category includes service contract requirements, basically agency oversight of the contract to make sure that CH is fulfilling all contract obligations. Coordination with Authority 2035. We have 1 electric meter at the joint intake facility, so we have to split the electric bill every month, which is actually a little bit more complicated than it sounds. It gets into pump run times and whose pump's running when, and we actually spend a little bit of money every month splitting the electric bill. And then a very small amount for distribution system coordination and testing, and that's in case we have any issue in any of the project partners' water system. We have the ability to reach out to an expert to help us. Continuing on, permits and water supply. This category is really dominated by the water supply and risk and alternatives evaluation. About $300,000 of the total amount is for that, and then a little bit for water rights support and supplemental water purchase investigations. Under water rights report, we now have to report basically every teaspoon of water use under both our state water board permit or water rate and also our CVP water rate. We have to track where every drop of water goes and report that to both the state and federal government. So we do have some effort involved in that every year. Onto agency administration, that's almost $800,000. That covers agency staff time and also treasurer and accounting services. One thing that we do include in this budget is we have, I think it's around $40,000 included for the special tax council in case we go the route of Board of Equalization. That was included in last year's budget, and I think the year before that. We've not spent that money last year, but we're including it in this year in case we end up there. It includes roughly $300,000 total between property taxes and insurance. That's almost half of that total. And the other miscellaneous category, that includes various organizations we're part of, such as ACWA, Northern California Water Association, Sacramento River Voluntary Spill Notification Network, to let us know if anything's happening in the river. But it also includes two different things. We have to do an update to the urban water management plan. That's an every 5-year thing. 2020, it's due again, so we included about $50,000 for that. And then the other $40,000 that's included in this category is for the Sacramento River Watershed Survey, our portion of those costs. And then we do include an operations contingency. Right now, we're showing up 5% of the total, which is a reduction over previous years. The debt category, we have really three things that are included in that. One of them is Woodland's reserve payment. Woodland is paying the reserve over 10 years. Davis paid theirs all in a one-time fund, so that's why you do not see one for the City of Davis. And then the two loans that we have to pay for over 20 years for Woodland and 30 years for Davis. Those are the final amounts for those. In terms of a comparison between this year's budget, what was approved, and what we're looking for next year, kind of really high-level view, and I'll go into a little bit more detail further down. The 100 category, the O&M category, we had budgeted $7.8 million or $6.8 million for this year. Sorry, we're expecting to spend right around 6.1. The primary reason for that being lower than what was expected is we did a forecast on what we think demand will be, and some part of it is still trying to figure out, since we had such a large demand reduction from 2012, 2013, how much of that comes back. So we kind of do a little bit of a guessing how much comes back. Is it 0? Is it 5 or 10%? So we maybe overestimated that slightly. But the other bigger part of it was that Term 91 last year was extended for a very long period of time. It went from early June to end of October, and then again in November. Because of that, we actually reduced production at the water plant every day from June through October to make sure that our senior water rate did last the entire duration. So instead of taking full supplies for everybody, we actually cut the plant down to stretch that water supply out. So we did come under in that category. If you go over to for this year's fiscal 20 budget, we're showing $7.6 million for that one, and that's reflective of Term 91 likely not being a factor this year. We should get full project flows for everybody without restrictions. And then there's also the inclusion of money for the pump repair at the joint intake. So really those two factors together, plus electricity costs and chemical cost increases, are why that's higher over last year, even though we spent less money last year. The O&M oversight category, we're showing a pretty major reduction, largely due to efficiencies going purely into an operations stage. We're not spending that category. We only, of the 340,000 budgeted, we're only spending about 140,000, so we're cutting that to 185 for next year. So that's a fairly significant reduction in that one. Permits and water supply category, we budgeted 179, we spent only about 13,000, and that's is likely due, what is due to the fact that we were able to do a water purchase agreement very easily last year. we didn't spend as much effort as we thought we would to make that happen. For budget for this next year, of that 400,000, about 300,000 is the water supply study. So that's really the dominant cost in that one. Agency administration, really looking at last year's budget to this year's budget is basically an inflationary increase, although it does include both the Urban Water Management Plan and the Sacramento River Watershed Survey. Those two total about $100,000. Those are due every 5 years, so it's a cost this year. We won't see that again until 2024. And the other reason why we're a little bit lower this year is because we do include budget for part of its tax council and a few other things that we just didn't spend this year that we keep in. Those are included again next year, just in case we need them next year. Operations contingency, we did cut that a little bit from 467 down to 450. We did not spend any of it this past year. But again, that's a 5% total. We used to have some categories that were 10%, some that were 5%. We did a global 5% this time, so it reduced a little bit. I could see that we may spend some of that money this year on other repairs of the joint intake and also the erosion repairs of the joint intake. So I think we could see some of that used this next year, although I hope we don't get to the 450. But it is a 5% number. It's kind of a, it could argue it could be a fairly high or a fairly low number depending how we look at it. And then the debt reserve payment is essentially the same as what it was last year, and that'll continue being the same numbers. I kind of covered a little bit of this already because I tend to get ahead of myself. So overall, the fiscal 20 budget is slightly higher than, actually it's slightly lower than, it's 8,000 lower now than the 19 budget. But the O&M side is slightly higher. And that's mainly due to the fact that we don't expect a Term 91 curtailment to really impact us this year. And then higher electricity and chemical cost. And again, we talked about how the O&M oversight budget is reduced mainly because we're purely in an O&M phase now. And we have a lot of efficiency gained over the last year that we felt very comfortable cutting that by roughly half. Water supply increase, I covered already, and that the increase of $200,000 is really due to the $300,000 study that's up for approval today. And then also the admin costs are slightly increased due to Urban Water Management Plan and the Sac River Watershed Survey. We did slightly decrease the contingency, as I said, to going to 5% across the board, and the debt payments are what they are. In terms of revenue sources, this is the breakdown between the three partners. City of Woodland is around 11.4 million, City of Davis 8 million, UC Davis 537,000, and RD 2035 about 183,000. This is kind of the breakdown of where the revenue is planned to come from based on all the categories. Any questions so far? Please.
I have just one, just for curiosity purposes. I recall that we get a special electricity rate. Is that true?
We do at the intake. At the intake, we have WAPA Power, so they have significantly lower rates. At PG&E, I don't believe so. I think we have like a large user industrial rate, which I think lower than residential, but I don't know that we have a truly special PG&E rate.
Yeah, it's the WAPA is the cut, and we have applied for that for some of the intake power, but that doesn't come into play till I think 2025. There's like a 7-year application period for that power reduction cost.
Yeah, I guess I'm just, PG&E is in the news so much these days. I'm just wondering, should we mentally prepare ourselves for seeing the electricity component of the cost increase? I see people nodding.
Yes, potentially, yes. And I believe the WAPA power wasn't it wasn't 100%. It's actually at the intake to get us our own electrical meter there so we can stop splitting the bill, but also some power at the water treatment plant itself. Right. But if I recall, it was only something like 20% of our total use. They did not allocate us 100% supply. And it's based on all they only sell to certain customers, and it depends on what electricity they have available and who their customers are, how much they can give us. So that's what we were allocated.
Okay.
So we're looking through transmission, how to get it transmitted to the water treatment plant.
So Bob is wanting to add in there. And then go ahead, Camille. So Bob first, then Camille.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Not directly related to the budget numbers, but a few slides back where you showed the comparison of the projected or proposed 19-20 budget compared to the 18-19, clearly we have an amount unspent already in the agency's hands. And I know in prior years we've talked about how that affects quarterly payments from the member agencies moving forward. In years past, we've kept to the quarterly schedule and sort of superfunded by keeping unspent prior year fund balance just for the greater uncertainty as the capital project was still in progress. And now with the capital project done, I don't know, this may be a question for the treasurer and ultimately for the board to decide on, but perhaps you could have that as part of your budget discussion before you complete it. I mean, are we all going to get a credit for that 1.7 million on our first quarterly payment? And I asked just from a city perspective to understand how our cash flow to support the agency would be affected.
Yeah, I can answer that actually. After we close the books on the year, it typically happens partway into the first quarter, and we know the final amount that we ended up under. We typically credit that back on the second quarter payment. So the cities and UC Davis's quarterly payment for Q2 will be reduced by what the refund amount is. It takes us a little bit of time after the close of the fiscal year to get all the final numbers together.
Sure. Camille?
This is not exactly material to the budget, but to the electricity discussion, has the agency ever considered a solar power PPA?
That's it was something that was considered several years ago, early in the design of the water treatment plant, and then it was kind of put on the shelf for a while because of the amount of time and effort it took to build an entirely new water treatment facility. So yeah, so actually Stan and I were talking about this a while back, that maybe that's something that we could pick up, is looking into doing that.
The only reason I bring this up is that the whole University of California system just issued an RFP, received back proposals, 33 of them, for different reasons, but the pricing is unbelievably favorable. We were looking at $20 to $40 for a megawatt hour, so it's better than WAPA.
Yeah.
One's observation. My recollection is when it was looked at the time, again, because of pricing, it was sort of a little bit of the wash, but my understanding is that there was accommodation on the site so that if at a future point there was a desire to go in that area, the site could theoretically accommodate a facility that's needed to serve. The other issue that we may want to come back later, I was just mentioning that the cities and the county are now also scrambling to understand what the potential impacts of PG&E's power shutoff program would be if areas of the grid serving the communities are impacted for a protracted period of time, and we want to make sure that we're also understanding the capability of the water plant intake and or the treatment plant and our local facilities to manage that risk, and looking for additional backup generator capacity and or alternative power sources is something. And so we'll just make sure that the needs of the water agency are part of those risk and management analysis.
Okay. So I think those are the questions. I thank you for answering them.
So there's Okay, so then there's really two items for the board to consider today is that adoption of the fiscal 20 budget and then the 3 consultant contracts that are before you today. That was the last slide that I had.
Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
The comment I have, Tim, is whoever put the budget together, thank you for being a bit conservative. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So on our agenda, we have an item 4, which is approve the budget, and the consultant contracts are the following agenda items. So why don't we go ahead and do it that way? So
Move approval of the budget for
I think
fiscal year
Rich
19.
made the motion. You can second.
No, I'm just kidding. I will second it. Thank you.
So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And yes, the way you have it presented is very clear, and also your descriptions were really helpful to understanding why there were differences in terms of what we saw in terms of actual versus what we're looking at seeing for the following year. So thank you.
Thank you.
So item 5. So maybe just a brief little thumbnail on the 3 different contracts, and then we can move to discussion.
Yes, yeah, I'll do kind of a very brief overview. The West Yost contract is, West Yost has been the agency's engineer since the beginning of the conception of the whole project. Their contract work these days generally consists of assisting the agency, so the agency doesn't have full-time staff, or even really technically part-time staff. So we actually pay West Yost to do all of the contract management oversight for the agency. They also, a large part of this contract is managing the effort for the water security analysis study. So they are actually bringing MBK under their contract as a subcontractor to them to do the calcium modeling on the Sacramento River, since the agency doesn't have a mechanism to contract with MBK directly. So it's really 2 categories, agency oversight of the contract and then the study. Kim Floyd Communications is a relatively small contract amount. She actually maintains our website for us and then has an on-call contract for anything we may need. And then ESA Associates, they are the agency's environmental consultant, and they have been for a decade now. They have 2 real tasks, some supporting tasks as part of the water security analysis study. We have to look at environmental considerations, and then also the supplemental EIR for the water purchase agreement with West Sacramento. Those 2 things. That's a relatively small amount. I think it's in the low 20,000s with them as well.
Thank you. So do we have any questions on this item? Is he shaking?
Move staff recommendation.
Rich, you want to second that?
Second it. Sorry to hear that.
Oh, that's okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great. So we are on to item 6.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier in the operations update, item 6 is related to the agreement to go ahead and have the intake pumps for the agency repaired. This was that item that when they went to do the previously approved switch from water cooling to oil cooling, they discovered some unexpected wear on the shafts and also the bearings. And through investigation, found out that, and I will say is, well, I'll go back to the beginning. Ultimately, what occurred was there was a bearing installed that was not part of the originally approved design. And ultimately, CH did not design this, nor did they build it. So, through our investigation, although our contract says CH is responsible for those repairs, this is one of those areas where, as they assumed responsibility for the intake that they did not build, staff did not feel that it was appropriate that they would bear that full cost, given that there was some inconsistencies to the design. So we worked through a cost sharing with them, talked to them about it. We looked at ultimately a 50-50 split. They did pay front some of that already, so that's why the approval amount in you doesn't look like 50-50, but they've already actually paid about $20-some thousand toward that. So the agreement before you is essentially an agreement with Jacobs to share in that cost between the agency and Jacobs to repair those pumps back to standard specs, with the right lower bearing installed as per design.
And just for clarification, RD 2035 doesn't have a share in this?
That's correct, because they're the agency's pumps. It's not part of the shared facilities.
Okay. So any questions on this item?
Yeah, just
Go ahead, Camille.
Just clarifying, so it does say in the memo from Tim, from the general manager, that the pumps were designed and installed by RD 2035. So just curious, was there any conversation about this?
Yeah, they were installed by RD 2035, the MWH Balfour Beatty contract. And during that construction, the agency had very little involvement, you may all recall. So this is something that we inherited. And we did reach back to the designer, the contractor, and RD 2035 and said, you know, our understanding that this pump was designed correctly, the shop drawings were correctly prepared. Sometime between shop drawing and installation, it changed. We could not get anyone to tell us who changed it and why. So we really don't have, as far as we can tell, anyone that we can reach back to if somebody made this mistake and we had the wrong bearings in the pumps. We spent a fair amount of time trying to discern that, but between the various parties, we couldn't get anything.
It's starting to feel like it might be interesting to put a list together of all of these nexes with RD 2035, just as part of the overall conversation. You may already have that put together.
Yeah, we do.
The grocery list of, yeah.
So would anybody like to make a motion for the item? Oh, sure, go ahead, Rich.
The comment I have, is this going to be a one-time shared cost? Since it looks like the company agrees that they assume the risk. So this is going to be a one-time deal, or are we going to be doing this from here on out?
For this particular event, it's a one-time deal. Certainly, as we've looked at them assuming the responsibility and we've seen some of these design issues, as staff bringing to the board, we didn't feel that it was appropriate that they, even though they assume they by contract assume that risk, in effect, with the partnership we have with them, we did not feel it was appropriate to essentially put that all on Jacobs. So certainly moving forward with the pumps, it is, contractually they are responsible to repair them, maintain them, replace them when they need to, and there's funds that they put away to the side to do that. But this is one of those where they took it over and we're into the second year of that operation where they've assumed that responsibility. This is essentially what we'd call an unknown condition or an unforeseen condition. So we felt it was appropriate to bring it to you for that split.
One thing I like to add is river pumps do not last nearly as long as groundwater well pumps do, and it's mainly because they pump sand and silt all day long. So they do have a much shorter lifespan than well pumps do. Well pumps should last 50 years, river pumps 10 to 15. So they do have a shorter lifespan than groundwater well pumps.
Okay, thank you. I'll move the item. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you for that. And we are now on item 7. So this item you mentioned earlier in today's meeting, if you can just refresh our memory in a sentence or two.
Yes, this is the memorandum of understanding between the agency and the other 5 partners, including City of Sacramento, West Sacramento, East Bay Mud, Placer County Water Agency, and Sac River Agency, basically to work together on preparation of the 2020 Sacramento River Watershed Sanitary Survey, as the document required by the State Water Resources Control Board every year. This is the agreement that we agreed to pay roughly 16.67% of the total study cost, along with a portion of City of Sacramento's project management, as they lead the effort and basically take care of the whole process for us. It's a very similar agreement to what the board approved last year. I think really the only thing we changed was the dates. And I think we added PCWA. They were not party to it last time, and this time they are. This MOU has already been reviewed by our attorney and all the other agencies. This is the final document that's already been basically approved by everybody.
Do we have any questions? Anybody like to move the item?
Moved.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Item 8.
I'll cover this one, Mr. Chair. As the board is aware, the agency is pursuing a settlement with the County of Yolo that involves annexation of the intake site to the City of Woodland. As part of that process, our co-owner of that site, Reclamation District 2035, has requested that in exchange for their support of that annexation, they request that the agency be responsible for any future City of Woodland tax assessment or charge that may be levied by the city against the intake site. Staff felt that that was a prudent request on 2035's part, so we prepared the proposed agreement that's in your agenda packet that would provide, assuming the site is annexed to Woodland's jurisdiction and then is subject to Woodland's tax authority, that we assume the obligation to pay any Woodland taxes on the site. We don't anticipate any Woodland taxes, assessments, et cetera, but in the event there are such, we would assume that responsibility, and staff recommends approval of this agreement.
I have a question for, maybe this is for, I don't know, if it's a Woodland-specific question, maybe it's just a legal question that, could then Woodland, let's say someday down the road, they approve a new tax that would impact this, could they then in that tax say, but the intake is somehow exempt or something like that? Is that legal?
With the tax, possibly. With other things, with assessments and service charges, the city's got less flexibility under Prop 218, but with taxes, you've got more flexibility, so that may be possible. And bond obligations can be a challenge, so it really depends on the issue.
Got it. Thank you. I'm pleased to move the item, given our longstanding partnership with RD 2035. I think this is a good step in continuing that good partnership.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. So I will note that on the last item, we have had a fair number of discussions around this topic. So the lack of discussion is not to imply that we are not fairly well informed on that item. So item 9, so that's consider election of board chair and vice chair. Since board member Stallard isn't here, and kind of the normal sort of way that we do this is the chair position swaps from city to city, so that so currently I'm chair from Davis. The next chair is kind of by process would be from Woodland. My guess is it would be nice to have both Woodland board members here when we actually make that selection as to who would be the next board member. Are you okay with that, Rich? That's not meant to say that you know, if you wanted to be board member, chair, that we wouldn't support that, but just in terms of fairness, I'm sure Tom would like to be here when we figure out which one of you, you know, thumb wrestles to figure out who's going to be the next board chair. Does that seem reasonable to staff? Does that sort of match up with what you were anticipating for this meeting?
Do you need action for us to extend the current chairmanship or to officially?
It just continues in that role until changed, so staff
Got
will
it.
just take the indication to defer this item to the next regular board meeting.
Do you need official action in that regard to table it? Or?
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
this discussion is sufficient.
There you go.
All right, so yes, as soon as we have a full complement of board members, we will take up this item. So if we could have it on the next agenda, the next board meeting agenda, that would be great. Long-range board calendar.
Yeah, the only thing that we have in the long-range board calendar right now, at least the next meeting, is September 19th. Although we may potentially have a special board meeting before that if we have the water purchase agreement completed before then and feel the need to get that done before that meeting. And then the next meeting after that is January 16th of 2020.
And I guess I'd like to state that right now it's listed as a bulleted agenda item for the September meeting, that we would discuss the UC Davis request to become part of the agency. And from UC Davis, what we would actually like is to have some time on one of these, either the September or the January agenda, to present a history of the project that we're pulling together and have a discussion around that. So the university has discussed, we are still interested, but we are definitely wanting to work through this whole discussion in a very methodical process. So we are not proposing September for that conversation.
Sure, and Camille and I did discuss that, and I did not change that language, so apologize for that.
So if I understand correctly, this would be perhaps separate agenda items. One would be the presentation of
Yes.
sort of the history and the current sort of where we are today. And then a separate agenda item in the future would be discussing the voting situation.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So we continue to think about, we continue to be interested. We continue to think about different kinds of voting structures that we could all discuss, but we want that deferred to a later date. The history, we started constructing it and discovered, and I did convey this to Stan, discovered that we had a lot of folks to talk to, and so we've been pulling it together, and we're really hopeful that it actually becomes very useful for this board and future boards, so that we have some recorded history that we can also co-create.
Sure. And do you believe the September timeframe is okay, or would you like keep us, so we'll keep it penciled in for September, but if you think that's too soon, we can always move it to the January.
And thank you, because right now we're thinking September, but as I look at the summer and what it holds, I'm thinking we may need January. But I really appreciate your holding it for September, and when can we check in on this? August would be fine?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah,
Update.
any time up toward, going toward that meeting, we can adjust the agenda.
Perfect.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions or requests for the long range? Rich? No. Okay. I don't know that we need a motion specifically, really, if we were going to change something. So item 11, technical advisory comments.
Just one for information, given the board meetings are quarterly. As I know the Davis Council members are aware, with the beginning of the new fiscal year approaching us, City of Davis has reorganized our public works functions, and we will be splitting into two departments. I'll be heading up the engineering and transportation functions, so I'll no longer have a management oversight role involving water operations. I'm in discussions with the city manager now how we want to staff this role as a technical committee member, which is part of our bylaws. And it's gotten a little interesting only because the role that Stan Gritzko, who will be promoted to a director overseeing our operations, which will include water, serving in the capacity before this board is representing this agency, and we wanted to have a firewall, if you will, between Tim and Stan, and yet with our reorganization, all of the water-related personnel will now report to Stan. So I may continue on in this role, but I'm just making you aware as evolution happens with organizational changes, you may see somebody else here come September representing the City of Davis perspective as opposed to the agency staff role that Stan is filling. So no concerns per se. I'm just making you aware of that.
Okay. Thank you. Board member comments. We'll start on the left. Camille?
Nothing further than what I brought up during long range calendar.
Okay. Rich? None. None for me as well, other than thank you, staff, and thank you, Lynn Ann. So I'm really used to getting everything electronically, but I must admit that having a paper copy of this is actually quite handy, and I appreciate that. Thank you. So anybody want to make a motion to adjourn, or do you want to hang around a little longer? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Anyway, thank you.